Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT patch rundown video. Today we'll be diving into the second patch of Set 6, 1123. Set 6 was a historic release for TFT because the balance was actually in a really good spot. A lot of that has to do with the Augment system because it diversifies what's playable in the meta. That said, there were definitely a few standout performers that are receiving some tweaks this patch, as well as a whole bunch of adjustments to Augments. With that, let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Before we touch on the balance changes, let's first talk about the newly added Double Up game mode. Double Up is, as the name suggests, the newest way to play TFT by pairing up with another player. This is the first iteration of duo mode for TFT, which adds both a social aspect to the game as well as a few new types of strategies. We recommend looking up how exactly Double Up functions because even though it is still TFT, playing and strategizing with another player really alters how the game plays out. Having a team-focused mode in TFT hints as a potential future for the game where playing with a friend or friends is actually viable. And maybe we'll even see a shift on the esports side of the game, as team games often get a lot more interest and excitement from viewers. This is definitely an exciting moment for TFT fans, and we're interested to see where the new game mode goes from here. Next up, let's cover the system changes for patch 1123. There's a whole bunch of augment tweaks we'll talk about later, but the system change to augments is additional possible arrangements of the different tiers. As players know, augments are split between silver, gold, and prismatic tiers. There's a certain amount of possibilities for each tier, which was originally 8 possible arrangements, but the new patch has bumped that up to 14. Keep in mind these new possible combinations of augment tiers are quite rare, so don't expect to see them often. Be sure to check out the patch notes to get the full details on the new arrangements. The other system change is a carousel UI change that allows players to inspect champions during the carousel. This has been an issue ever since they removed being able to interact with champions at all on the bench, so it's nice to see them loosen up on what players are able to do during the carousel. We still miss the days of being able to sell during carousel, and we'll likely never have that return, but at least inspecting champions is once again a thing. With that, we can dive into the many augment changes they've done for patch 1123. There are a lot of changes here, as quite a few augments were moved from one tier to another, or in some cases, won't show up depending on the stage. For the full list of changes, again, we recommend checking out the full patch notes, as we'll mainly be covering the most meta-relevant changes. Our first augment to talk about with tangible changes is to Runic Shield. They've made it so the Shield Arcanist gain is no longer infinite, instead it will only last 8 seconds. Of course, this is a fairly huge change, so they're buffing the amount of shield to 300, 450, 600% from 250, 375, 500%. Infinity shields are, understandably, never going to be well balanced. 8 seconds is relatively short, though don't be surprised if they revisit this number in the future. Overall, not a bad change, but definitely makes the augment less appealing. Titanic Force has had multiple changes since PBE, and this time they've increased the health threshold to 1400 from 1300, while also lowering the bonus AD to 3% from 4%. Titanic can be an amazing augment depending on the board, but oftentimes it was too valuable since 4 and 5 cost champions almost always met the health requirement at tier 2. Now it's more exclusive to high health champions or making a player commit an item to boost up the unit's health. Woodland Charm went from really good in the early game to now being a prismatic augment. To make it prismatic worthy, the clone's health is up to 1500 from 1300. All in all, Woodland Charm was often the clear winner compared to the other gold augment options on 1.4. Now as a prismatic, it'll be interesting to see where its value falls. We expect to see it significantly less in the 1123 meta. Next up is Underdogs, which can be an underwhelming augment but can overperform on boards with bruisers and other high health units. To tweak this slightly, they've increased the health regen to 12% missing health, but capped out the amount per second to 200. It's still great on high health units and should be slightly better on others. Definitely good adjustments. Trading Dummy is an obvious choice a lot of the time because, as it turns out, more health on your board is pretty good, especially in the early game. So to make it just a tad bit less appealing, they've lowered the health to 500 from 600. Still good, especially with scaling, but maybe not the obvious pick a lot of the time anymore. Artifacts were quite good back when Ornn was around, but Portable Forge didn't quite live up to that legacy. Sure, some items were great, like Collector, but others were just lackluster. To address this, they've buffed Death's Dance, Muramana, Obsidian Cleaver, Randuin's Omen, and Rocket Propelled Fist. For exact details, we recommend reading the patch notes, but overall, there's a lot of significant buffs to these items, and honestly, they needed it. Next are what we're going to refer as small changes, with the first one being All for One, an Imperial Augment. They've lowered the health gain to 33% from 40%, which is quite a sizable reduction. It likely needed to happen because this augment was one of the reasons why Imperial was able to do well. Hopefully they buff either the units or the trait itself to compensate for this change. Built Different was, as the name suggests, built differently since it absolutely dominated the early stages of the game when used. Interestingly, the number adjustments aren't crazy as they've lowered the bonus health to 300, 400, 500 from 300, 450, 600, and the attack speed to 50, 60, 70 from 50, 65, 80. This does make sense as it was really the tier 2 and 3 of the augment that were doing well. Definitely plenty strong despite the nerfs, but may not be an effortless top 4 anymore. And the final augment to talk about is Windfall. This is mostly a bug fix as Windfall was providing 5 extra gold at 0 and 1 augments. Of course, it's still absolutely bonkers as far as augments are concerned when you get it early game, but 5 less gold at least makes it slightly less amazing. As you said, there's plenty more changes to augments than we've talked about here, so be sure to read over the full patch notes. Let's now move on to the trait changes for patch 11.23. Most synergies are in a good spot, but there's a few standouts they've addressed this patch, beginning with Academy. Academy provides such a huge boost in stats that champions like Yone scale incredibly well, so to make that scaling slightly weaker, they've lowered the starting stats to 18, 35, 50, 70, and the scaling per cast down to 3, 5, 8, 12. Basically, this affects the higher tiers of Academy more than the lower, but overall, it's a much-needed nerf to bring Academy in line with other synergies. Bodyguard has fantastic champions, but is a bit lackluster, so to spice it up, they've added a shield that appears after the taunt. This is nice, but a bit boring considering a frontline with shields is already a thing with protectors. That said, the synergy needed a change, and even if this one isn't amazing, it is at least a buff. Colossus is also quite lackluster since committing 4 spaces to 2 units is a bit excessive. To make the trait more appealing, the damage reduction is now 30% from 25%, which is okay, but still only worth utilizing in niche situations. Next up is Enforcer, an interesting utility synergy that certainly had a place in the meta, but had a few issues. Most notably is that it overlapped with Zephyr, so now Zephyr takes priority and the Enforcer debuff will apply to a different champion. Same with when a unit is immune to CC, which makes Enforcer a lot more appealing as a splash trait later on in the game. Imperial without augments was not so great, so they buffed the team bonus damage to 50% from 40%. Not much to write home about, but the synergy definitely needed some type of baseline increase. The largest change to the patch is to Innovator with a whole ton of tweaks. The Spark Notes version is they've lowered the base stats of the Innovator summons while increasing the star level scaling. On top of that, the dragon is now immune to CC, has less attack range, and slightly shorter duration for its fear, but hits more of the board with it. Basically, the dragon is more intimidating towards the front line and less of an auto-attacking focused unit. Mutant is another synergy with quite a few changes, but the gist of it is that they made the weaker mutations like Cybernetic Enhancement better, and the overpowered ones like Voracious Appetite a bit weaker. On average, Mutant is still plenty strong, but there's at least more options to choose from now. Onto the smaller changes with the bonus health from Bruiser going down to 125, 225, 350 from 125, 250, 400. Bruiser should remain strong early game, but slightly weaker later on, which is overall a good thing considering how prominent Bruiser champions are in the meta. And finally, Clockwork is getting a buff at tier 2 and 3, as the attack speed is going up to 10, 30, 55%. As we always say, attack speed scales really well, so a 5% buff is quite good, though committing that many units on your board to Clockwork is unlikely outside of the augments. Now we can talk about the final section with champion changes. Up first, we have a nerf to Ezreal, who's doing quite well in the early game, particularly thanks to Scrap. To keep him in check, they've lowered his ability's damage to 25, 50, 100 from 30, 60, 90. Despite nerfs, though, the real power to Ezreal is his attack speed scaling in Scrap, so these changes may not be all that impactful. Ziggs gets 5 more attack damage. Woo! Okay, it looks like a joke, but in reality, it's to help prevent Ziggs from losing the first round of PvE. Yes, this was able to happen, and yes, it was quite sad to see. Next is a change to Twisted Fate's starting mana, going from 30 to 0, because basically instantly casting for him was a bit too good, especially with Morellonomicon. Still strong, particularly if you have a blue buff, but not as annoying to play against anymore. Assassins have struggled, so expect to see a few buffs with the first to Katarina, who gains a bit more damage per tier to her ability. Keep in mind that Academy was nerfed, so these changes end up evening out for Katarina, though at tier 3 Cat should be slightly better. The other assassin change is the Shaco, as he's gaining additional attack damage scaling on his ability, going from 175% to 185%. A decent increase for sure, and may help Shaco become a viable carry beyond stage 3. Enough to make him a viable late game contender? Probably not, but we'll have to see. Both Gangplank and Misfortune are getting hit by the nerf bat because, as it turns out, Mercenary is pretty good when you can easily cash out when you need to. This should help the synergy be less dominating in the meta, though it is sad to see Gangplank nerfs. Despite Imperial being a bit weak, Samira was doing fairly well, so they are nerfing her. With only a minor buff to Imperial and the nerfs to both Samira and one of the Augments, we may see even less Imperial this patch than before. Urgot was another problem in the meta, so they've toned down his attack damage to 70 from 75 and scaling to 25% from 30%. Urgot should remain viable, but not as dominant after these changes. Despite being under small changes, Dr. Mundo has quite a few buffs and nerfs. In general, the goal here is to lower his damage, but to make him heal a bit more. What this should do is make him more of a beefy frontline tank and less of a 1v9 late game carry tank. Yone is being hit by the Academy nerfs already, so they went light on him with only a 0.5 attack speed nerf. Still, attack speed scaling can be impactful, so altogether these changes should put Yone in a healthier spot than he was in 1122. Unfortunately, the decision was to nerf multiple 5 costs, which isn't great for the meta because having strong 5 costs makes the late game a lot more interesting. But they've gone light with Jace, only losing 10 bonus armor and magic resist in melee form. Jinx went down to 1.05 attack speed from 1.1, Yumi lost 50 health, and Tom Kent should no longer delete units when eating them. Overall, these aren't major nerfs by any means, but they should leave these 4-5 costs in a better place in the meta, but it is a bit of a slippery slope when nerfing late game champions. On the plus side, Galio is receiving a buff to his starting mana, and the damage he does at tier 1 is going up to 150 from 125. Again, like the other 5 costs, these are minor adjustments, but Galio is on the weaker side considering he takes up 2 spots on the board, so any buffs are good to see. That's going to be it for today's video. There's quite a lot of changes to look over in this patch, so we highly recommend reading the patch notes or at least having them on hand when diving into Ranked. Let us know in the comment section below what was your favorite change in this patch. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.